the summer of 1906, 3 gunshots echoed across the rooftop of Madison Square Garden, and America would never forget the name Stanford White. But here's what history doesn't tell you. At least 17 people witnessed what happened that night, and you've only heard from 3 of them. The architects, the millionaires, the beautiful showgirl caught between 2 powerful men. But what about the waiter who served champagne moments before the killing? What about the stage manager who'd seen Stanford White's private elevator carry dozens of young girls to his secret apartment? What about the seamstress who'd been sewing costumes in the theater for 15 years and knew exactly which chorus girls suddenly disappeared after catching White's attention? Their testimonies exist, buried in courthouse archives, scribbled in police ledgers that no historian bothered to fully examine, dismissed in newspaper accounts that deemed them unreliable or of questionable character. These voices were silenced not because they lied, but because they told truths that powerful people didn't want heard. In an era where your social standing determined whether your words carried weight in a courtroom, being poor, foreign-born female, or simply working class meant your version of events was expendable. This is the story behind the story, the testimony beneath the testimony. Because while the world fixated on a love triangle between a millionaire architect, a jealous heir, and the most photographed woman in America, the people who actually understood what happened that night, who saw the pattern of predation, who witnessed the cover-ups, who tried to sound alarms years before blood spattered across white tablecloths, were systematically erased from the narrative. Stanford White wasn't just shot on a rooftop theater. He was a 52-year-old man who'd spent decades using his wealth, influence, and architectural genius as cover for something far darker. And the people who could have stopped him, who tried to warn authorities, who possessed evidence that would have painted an entirely different picture of that fatal night, were deemed too insignificant to matter. If cases like this fascinate you, stories where the truth hides in plain sight, buried under layers of privilege and prejudice, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Because sometimes the most important evidence isn't what made the headlines. It's what was deliberately kept out of them. June 25, 1906. Madison Square Garden's Rooftop Theater. Opening night of a musical revue called Mam'selle Champagne. New York's elite gathered under strings of electric lights, a technological marvel that turned night into artificial day. The wealthy perched at small tables, sipping champagne, while performers danced across the stage. It was the kind of evening where fortunes were displayed as casually as calling cards, where architects rubbed shoulders with railroad magnates, where chorus girls in the show below dreamed of catching the eye of a patron who might change their lives. Stanford White sat at his usual table, alone but hardly isolated. At 52, he was American royalty, the architect who designed the Washington Square Arch, the original Madison Square Garden, mansions for the Vanderbilts and Astors. His red mustache and imposing frame were instantly recognizable. He'd built the very building whose rooftop he now occupied, and he moved through it with the confidence of a man who owned not just the architecture, but the social landscape itself. Harry Kendall Thaw entered at approximately 10:30. Younger jittery, the son of a Pittsburgh railroad and coal fortune. He walked with his wife, Evelyn Nesbit Thaw, a woman whose face had launched 1,000 magazine covers. At 21, she was already famous, a Gibson girl, an artist's model, a chorus performer who transcended the stage to become something approaching American aristocracy through marriage. Her beauty was the kind that stopped conversations. Her past was the kind that started them. The show continued. Performers sang. The audience laughed and drank. And then, during a musical number, Harry Thaw stood up. He walked across the rooftop. He approached Stanford White's table. Witnesses would later disagree on almost everything: his expression, his pace, whether he said anything before raising the pistol. But they all agreed on what happened next. 3 shots. The first struck White in the shoulder. The second hit him in the face. The third went through his brain. Stanford White, one of America's most celebrated architects, collapsed backward, his chair tipping, his body crumpling among the champagne glasses and linen napkins of New York's elite. Blood pooled on the rooftop he designed. Women screamed. Men rushed forward. And Harry Thaw stood there, pistol still raised, and allegedly said words that would become infamous. He ruined my wife. The trial that followed became known as the trial of the century. Newspapers sold millions of copies. Evelyn Nesbit's testimony about Stanford White's seduction of her when she was 16 captivated the nation. Harry Thaw's lawyers argued temporary insanity, claiming righteous rage over his wife's defilement. The case had everything: wealth, beauty, sex, violence, and a victim whose reputation could be destroyed to justify his murder. But that's the story you know. The one that's been told and retold for over a century. The one that reduces a complex crime to a simple narrative. Innocent girl, predatory architect, avenging husband. Except the people who actually worked in Stanford White's orbit, who saw the patterns, who witnessed the machinery of privilege that protected him, weren't given space in that narrative. Their testimonies were inconvenient, complicated, dangerous to powerful interests. So they were buried. Until now. The morning after Stanford White's murder, every newspaper in America screamed the story. The New York Times ran it above the fold with a headline that captured the era's breathless sensationalism. Stanford White shot down. Harry Thaw fires 3 times. Within hours, newsboys were selling special editions on every corner from Boston to San Francisco. This wasn't just a murder. This was spectacle, entertainment, a glimpse into the private lives of people so wealthy and famous that their scandals felt like mythology come to life. The public devoured every detail. Stanford White, brilliant architect, member of the most exclusive clubs, designer of monuments that defined American grandeur, dead on a rooftop he'd created. Harry Thaw, millionaire playboy, known for erratic behavior and explosive jealousy, standing over the body with a smoking gun. And at the center of it all, Evelyn Nesbit, whose beauty had been reproduced on magazine covers, cigarette cards, and studio photographs that young women across the country tried to imitate. She was the Gibson girl ideal made flesh, and now she was tangled in a murder that would expose the rotting foundation beneath Gilded Age glamour. The story wrote itself, or so it seemed. Newspapers painted Stanford White as either a martyr to artistic genius or a predatory monster, depending on which version sold more copies that day. Harry Thaw became either a heroic defender of womanly virtue or a madman whose wealth had protected him from consequences his entire life. Evelyn was simultaneously innocent victim and knowing seductress, virgin and fallen woman, depending on who was doing the describing and what moral point they wanted to make. But let's talk about what actually happened in the months and years before those 3 shots rang out. Because this wasn't a crime of sudden passion. This was the inevitable conclusion of a story that dozens of people had been watching unfold, trying to warn about, attempting to intervene in, only to be ignored because they lacked the social currency to make anyone listen. Stanford White's reputation as a seducer of young women wasn't a secret among New York's theatrical community. It was common knowledge, whispered about in dressing rooms, discussed in hushed tones among the mothers of chorus girls who tried desperately to keep their daughters away from his attention. White maintained an apartment at 24th Street, a place he called his studio, filled with exotic furnishings, a red velvet swing, and mirrors positioned at angles that suggested purposes far removed from architectural drafting. He would attend performances, mark which young women caught his eye, and deploy a network of intermediaries to arrange introductions. Evelyn Nesbit had been 16 when she met him in 1901. She was performing in the chorus of a Broadway show called Florodora, one of dozens of beautiful girls who danced and sang for modest wages while hoping for something better. Her father had died when she was young. Her family was poor. She'd been modeling since she was 14, her face and figure becoming famous, while she remained financially desperate. When Stanford White, celebrated and charming and 50 years old, began paying attention to her, it must have seemed like salvation. What happened next would become the centerpiece of the trial. White allegedly gave her champagne, her first alcohol, in his velvet-draped apartment. She woke up hours later in his bed, bleeding, with no memory of what had happened. She was 16. He was 50. And this was the man Harry Thaw shot 5 years later on a rooftop. But here's what the mainstream narrative always glossed over. Evelyn Nesbit wasn't Stanford White's first. She wasn't even close. The chorus girls, the models, the young women who cycled through his apartment and his attention were numerous enough that people who worked in New York's theatrical district could tell you stories. They knew about the red velvet swing. They knew about the champagne. They knew about the girls who went to his studio and came back different, or didn't come back at all. They tried to tell people. Stage managers warned newcomers. Older chorus girls pulled aside the young ones. Mothers who worked as seamstresses and dressers in the theaters developed whisper networks, trying to protect daughters and nieces from catching White's eye. But Stanford White was powerful. He was rich. He was connected to every important family in New York. He designed their homes, their clubs, their monuments. When working-class women suggested he was dangerous, they were dismissed as jealous, hysterical, or simply lying. The trial began in January 1907, 7 months after the shooting. It lasted 3 months and became the most covered criminal proceeding in American history to that point. Over 100 reporters packed the courtroom daily. Artists sketched every moment. The testimony was so scandalous that women were officially barred from attending, though many disguised themselves as men or bribed their way in anyway. Harry Thaw's defense was simple: temporary insanity brought on by learning the full extent of what Stanford White had done to his wife. His lawyers painted White as a predator who drugged and raped Evelyn when she was a child. They described Thaw as a righteous husband driven mad by the knowledge that his pure bride had been defiled by a monster. It was a narrative perfectly calibrated for an era that idealized female innocence and masculine protection, even as it systematically ignored the testimony of women who weren't beautiful or rich enough to deserve such protection. Evelyn took the stand. For 3 days, she described her seduction, or assault, depending on how you interpreted her carefully worded testimony. She described the apartment, the champagne, waking up in White's bed. She became, overnight, the most famous woman in America. Her testimony was reproduced in newspapers, discussed in drawing rooms, analyzed in editorials. She was 22 years old, sitting in a witness box, describing her sexual history to a room full of men while the nation listened. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial, in 1908, found Harry Thaw not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed to an asylum for the criminally insane, from which he would eventually escape and, through legal maneuvering and family wealth, secure his release. He would live until 1947, dying at 76. Evelyn would spend the rest of her life trading on her notoriety, performing in vaudeville, appearing in films, giving interviews about the case. She would never escape being the woman in the Stanford White case. And Stanford White, his reputation was destroyed. The man who'd built some of America's most beautiful structures became known primarily as a predator who'd gotten what he deserved. His architectural legacy was eclipsed by scandal. Buildings he designed were later demolished without ceremony. His name became shorthand for Gilded Age excess and corruption. That's the story America told itself. The story that made sense. The story that fit into neat categories of villain and victim, predator and avenger. But what about the people who'd been trying to tell that story for years before the murder? What about the witnesses whose testimony could have prevented White's crimes, or at least documented them in ways that might have led to actual justice, rather than a murder on a rooftop? They were in the courtroom. Some of them even testified, but their words were shaped, edited, and often dismissed in ways that served the narratives more powerful people wanted to tell. To understand what really happened, not just that night in 1906, but in the years leading up to it, we need to hear from the people history decided weren't worth listening to. In 1906, not all witnesses were created equal. Your testimony's value in an American courtroom wasn't determined by what you saw or what you knew, but by who you were. At the top of the credibility hierarchy stood wealthy white men, businessmen, professionals, property owners. Their word was gospel. Their character was assumed. When they spoke, judges listened, juries believed, and newspapers quoted them without question. Everyone else existed on a sliding scale of believability that had nothing to do with honesty and everything to do with social standing. Women's testimony was suspect by default, considered too emotional, too hysterical, too influenced by feminine weakness to be reliable. Working-class witnesses were assumed to be seeking attention or money. Immigrants spoke with accents that made juries uncomfortable, their foreignness itself a form of suspicion. Servants were dismissed as gossips. Children were too young to understand what they'd seen. And anyone who worked in the theater, that world of painted faces and moral ambiguity, was automatically presumed to be lying, exaggerating, or too corrupted by their profession to tell the truth. This wasn't informal bias. It was codified in legal practice. Character witnesses could be called to undermine testimony, and character was defined almost entirely by social class and respectability. A woman who worked in a factory had less credibility than a woman who didn't work at all. A man with an Irish accent was less believable than a man with a Harvard education. The legal system wasn't designed to find truth. It was designed to reinforce existing hierarchies, to protect the powerful, and to ensure that uncomfortable revelations from the lower classes could be safely dismissed. Stanford White understood this implicitly. His entire pattern of behavior relied on the fact that chorus girls, models, and young women from poor families had no credible voice. They could talk all they wanted in dressing rooms and tenement apartments, but the moment they tried to make formal accusations against a man of his stature, the system would crush them. Their poverty was proof of their unreliability. Their profession was evidence of loose morals. Their youth made them impressionable and easily confused. And if they'd accepted any money or gifts from White, which of course they had, because they were desperately poor, then they were clearly opportunists trying to extort a successful man. The legal concept of prior bad acts worked in only one direction. Defense attorneys could destroy a woman's credibility by suggesting she'd had previous romantic relationships or worked in morally questionable professions. But prosecutors couldn't introduce evidence of a defendant's pattern of behavior unless it directly related to the specific charge. This meant that even if Stanford White had assaulted dozens of young women, a court case about one specific incident couldn't reference the others. Each crime existed in isolation, and the testimony of women who could have established a pattern was ruled inadmissible. During the Thaw trials, this dynamic played out repeatedly. Harry Thaw's defense team wanted to paint Stanford White as a serial predator to justify their client's rage. But the prosecution, which should have been defending White's reputation, couldn't introduce testimony from working-class witnesses about his behavior because those witnesses lacked credibility. The result was a bizarre legal dance where everyone in the courtroom knew White had a reputation, but almost no one who could speak directly to that reputation was allowed to testify in detail. The few working-class witnesses who did make it to the stand faced brutal cross-examination designed to destroy their credibility through class-based humiliation. Defense attorneys would ask about their wages, their living situations, their education level, their family backgrounds. They would question whether these witnesses had ever borrowed money, accepted gifts, or engaged in any behavior that could be twisted into evidence of bad character. The goal wasn't to uncover truth. It was to remind the jury that these people didn't matter, that their testimony was inherently less valuable than that of respectable citizens. Newspapers reinforced these hierarchies through their coverage. When wealthy witnesses testified, their words were reported as fact. When working-class witnesses spoke, their testimony was framed with qualifiers: claimed, alleged, insisted. The woman who cleaned Stanford White's apartment became a domestic who alleged. The stage manager who'd worked in New York theaters for 20 years became a theatrical employee who claimed. The language itself taught readers who to believe. There was another layer to this hierarchy: gender and sexuality. The entire Thaw defense rested on the idea that Evelyn Nesbit had been an innocent virgin when Stanford White assaulted her, and that this innocence made her violation a justifiable cause for murder. But this logic implicitly argued that women who weren't virgins, who'd had previous relationships, or who worked in professions associated with sexuality, deserved whatever happened to them. Their assaults didn't count. Their testimony about predatory men was automatically dismissed as the complaints of women who'd made their own choices and now regretted them. This created an impossible situation for women trying to warn about dangerous men. If you were too respectable, you couldn't possibly know about such sordid matters. If you knew about such matters, you clearly weren't respectable. The catch: 22 meant that the women best positioned to testify about predatory patterns, those who'd witnessed them firsthand, who'd survived them, who'd helped other women escape them, were automatically discredited by the very knowledge that made their testimony valuable. The trial of the century featured testimony from millionaires, architects, doctors, and alienists, the era's term for psychiatrists. These men spoke at length about Evelyn Nesbit's mental state, Stanford White's character, and Harry Thaw's sanity. They were quoted extensively. Their expert opinions shaped the verdict. But the women who'd actually lived through Stanford White's predation, who'd seen the pattern years before Evelyn Nesbit entered the picture, who could have told the court exactly how White operated and how many victims he'd left in his wake, were either never called or were dismissed so quickly their testimony barely made the transcripts. This wasn't an accident. This was the system working exactly as designed. Because if courts had actually listened to working-class women, to servants, to chorus girls, to the people who witnessed the daily operations of power and privilege, the entire social order would have been threatened. The Gilded Age relied on the silence of people who saw too much. It required that certain voices remain unheard, certain testimonies remain buried, certain truths remain unspeakable. And so they were, until archival researchers, decades later, began digging through the full trial transcripts, the police reports that never made it to court, the newspaper accounts that ran in working-class papers rather than mainstream publications, until historians started asking different questions. Not just what happened on that rooftop in 1906, but what had been happening for years before. Who tried to warn people? Who saw the danger coming? And why didn't anyone listen? The answers to those questions live in the testimonies of people whose names you've never heard, people who were in the room, who saw everything, who told the truth, and who were dismissed because truth, in 1906 America, was a privilege reserved for people who already had power. Her name was Margaret O'Brien, though the court records sometimes listed her as the Irish domestic or simply the cleaning woman. She was 43 years old in 1906, a widow who'd emigrated from County Cork 20 years earlier. She'd raised 3 children while working as a housekeeper for wealthy New York families, moving through their private spaces with the invisibility that servants perfected, present but unseen, listening but unheard. For the last 8 years of Stanford White's life, she'd cleaned his apartment at 24 West 24th Street, twice a week, every Tuesday and Friday morning, arriving at 9 o'clock when the architect was usually at his office. Margaret O'Brien saw everything. The apartment that newspapers would later describe in breathless, scandalous detail, the red velvet swing hanging from the ceiling, the mirrors positioned at calculated angles, the exotic fabrics and elaborate furnishings. She'd dusted every surface, swept every corner, changed every sheet. She knew that apartment better than Stanford White himself. She knew which rooms were used and which were for show. She knew where he kept the champagne, the gifts he'd give to young visitors, the photographer's equipment he sometimes set up. She knew because it was her job to clean up afterward. And she tried to tell someone, multiple times. Years before Stanford White was shot on that rooftop. In 1903, 3 years before the murder, Margaret O'Brien went to her priest. Father Donovan at St. Francis Xavier Church on West 16th Street had known her since she'd arrived in New York. He was someone she trusted, someone she thought might know what to do with the information that was eating at her conscience. She told him about the apartment, about the young girls, and they were girls, some of them couldn't have been more than 15, who she'd encounter occasionally when her schedule shifted or when Mr. White forgot to tell her not to come, about the champagne bottles she'd find, the stained linens, the pieces of torn clothing shoved into corners. Father Donovan listened. He told her to pray. He told her that she should be grateful for steady employment in these uncertain times. He reminded her that speaking ill of her employer, especially one as important as Stanford White, could cost her not just her position but her reputation. Who would hire a domestic who gossiped about the private affairs of prominent men? He suggested that perhaps she was misinterpreting what she saw, that theatrical people had different standards, that it wasn't her place to judge. Margaret left that meeting understanding that she was alone with what she knew. The church wouldn't help. The police certainly wouldn't listen to an Irish cleaning woman making accusations against one of New York's most celebrated architects. Her children needed her income. She had no husband to support her. So she did what countless women in her position had done before. She kept cleaning, kept her eyes down, and tried to live with the weight of her silence. But in 1905, something happened that Margaret couldn't ignore. She arrived at the apartment on a Friday morning, her usual time, and found a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16, sitting on the edge of the bed crying. The girl was still in her undergarments. Her dress was torn and discarded in the corner. She was bleeding. When Margaret asked what had happened, the girl just shook her head and kept crying. Margaret helped her dress. She gave her a handkerchief. She asked if the girl wanted her to call someone, find someone, get help. The girl refused. She was terrified, Margaret would later testify, more afraid of what would happen if anyone found out than of what had already happened to her. She begged Margaret not to tell anyone. Then she left, walking unsteadily, and Margaret never saw her again. This time, Margaret went to the police, not to the precinct house, where Stanford White's friends and fellow club members might have connections, but to a neighborhood station in the Gashouse district where she thought a working-class woman might have a chance of being heard. She told her story to a desk sergeant named Thomas Murphy, himself an Irish immigrant. She described what she'd seen, what she'd cleaned up over the years, what the girl had looked like that morning. Sergeant Murphy wrote nothing down. He told her, not unkindly, that she was describing matters between consenting adults, that Mr. Stanford White was a respected gentleman who contributed to the city's cultural life, that young women who visited men's apartments knew what they were getting into, that without the girl herself making a complaint, there was nothing to investigate. And he warned her, gently but firmly, that if she continued making such accusations, she could be charged with slander or defamation, that she should think about her children and her future before she said anything else. Margaret O'Brien went back to work. She continued cleaning the apartment twice a week. She continued finding evidence of what Stanford White was doing, and she continued being powerless to stop it, because she was a 43-year-old Irish widow whose testimony meant nothing against a man who designed monuments. When Harry Thaw shot Stanford White in June 1906, Margaret read about it in the newspapers like everyone else. She recognized the apartment described in the salacious coverage. She'd cleaned those very rooms countless times. She recognized the red velvet swing that journalists wrote about with such shocked fascination. She dusted that swing every week for 8 years. And when Evelyn Nesbit described waking up in Stanford White's bed with no memory and blood on the sheets, Margaret knew exactly what bed she meant. She'd changed those sheets. During the first trial, in early 1907, Margaret O'Brien came forward. She wrote a letter to the district attorney's office, offering to testify about what she'd witnessed in the apartment. She thought, naively perhaps, that now people would listen, that with Stanford White dead and the whole city talking about his crimes, her testimony might finally matter. The prosecution never called her. They were defending Stanford White's reputation, trying to prove that Harry Thaw was a murderous madman rather than a righteous avenger. The last thing they wanted was a witness who would corroborate Evelyn Nesbit's claims about White's predatory behavior. Harry Thaw's defense team did call her, but only briefly, and the cross-examination was devastating. The prosecutor asked about her wages, $5 a week. He asked about her education. She'd left school at 12 to work. He asked if she'd ever been arrested. No, but her brother had been, for public drunkenness. He asked if she understood that she was accusing a dead man, unable to defend himself, of terrible crimes based on what she claimed to have seen. He emphasized claimed. He asked if she'd ever considered that she might have misunderstood what she witnessed. He asked if Mr. White had always paid her on time, treated her well, given her Christmas bonuses. Yes to all of it. Then came the question designed to destroy her credibility. Mrs. O'Brien, if you truly believed Mr. White was committing crimes in that apartment, why did you continue working for him? Why did you continue taking his money? Why didn't you quit if your conscience was so troubled? She had no good answer. The real answer, that she had 3 children to feed and no other employment prospects, and had already tried telling people who wouldn't listen, sounded like excuses. The jury saw a woman who'd worked for a man for 8 years, accepted his wages, and was now, conveniently after his death, claiming she'd witnessed terrible things. It looked like opportunism, like a servant trying to insert herself into a sensational case for attention or money. Her testimony was dismissed. Newspapers barely mentioned it. The few accounts that did refer to her described her as a domestic who claimed to have witnessed questionable activities, or a cleaning woman whose testimony was not considered credible by the court. Her name appeared in some transcripts as M. O'Brien, or the witness O'Brien, stripped of even her full identity. But Margaret O'Brien's testimony, buried in those trial transcripts, tells us something crucial people knew. Not just suspected, not just gossiped, but actually knew what Stanford White was doing. They saw the evidence. They tried to report it, and they were silenced not through violence or direct threats, but through the systematic dismissal of their credibility based on their class, their gender, their ethnicity, and their economic vulnerability. After the trial, Margaret O'Brien disappeared from the historical record. No one followed up with her. No journalist interviewed her for the human interest story of the servant who witnessed history. She went back to her life, back to cleaning other people's homes, back to invisibility. She tried to speak. The system had made it clear that her voice didn't matter. But she saw everything. And what she saw was a pattern, repeated over years, that could have been stopped if anyone with power had been willing to listen to a woman whose only crime was being poor and Irish and honest about what she'd witnessed. Susie Johnson wasn't supposed to be anyone important. She was 28 years old in 1906, a seamstress who worked in the costume department at the Casino Theater on Broadway and 39th Street. She'd been sewing theatrical costumes since she was 14, following her mother into the trade, spending 12-hour days in poorly lit workrooms, stitching elaborate gowns that chorus girls would wear for 3-minute numbers. Her fingers were scarred from needle pricks, her eyes strained from close work, her back permanently curved from hunching over fabric. She earned $7 a week, slightly more than a factory worker, but far less than anyone on stage. Susie had what people in the theater world called institutional knowledge. She'd worked at 5 different Broadway theaters over 14 years. She knew which stage managers were handsy, which producers expected sexual favors in exchange for roles, which chorus girls had wealthy patrons, and which men in the audience were dangerous. The theater district had an entire underground information network run by women like Susie, seamstresses, dressers, wig mistresses, wardrobe supervisors, who passed warnings from show to show, trying to protect the younger girls from predators. Stanford White's name came up often in those conversations. By the time Susie started working at the Casino Theater in 1899, White was already well known among theater workers as someone to avoid. The older women would point him out when he attended performances, always sitting in the same box seat, always watching the chorus with unsettling intensity. They'd warn new girls. If Stanford White sends someone backstage to introduce himself, find an excuse to leave. If he invites you to see his studio, decline politely. If he offers you money or gifts, understand what he's really paying for. But here's what made Susie Johnson different. She kept records. In a small notebook she stored in her sewing basket, she documented warnings, incidents, and the names of girls who'd had encounters with dangerous men. It wasn't a formal log, just dates, initials, brief descriptions written in the margins between sketches of costume designs. SW sent flowers to EM. She didn't come back to work. AB invited to 24th Street apartment. Returned upset. Wouldn't discuss. FL said SW gave her champagne. Woke up confused. Quit the show 3 days later. Susie didn't set out to become a documentarian of sexual predation in the theater district. She just noticed patterns. She saw the same names appearing again and again. She watched young women arrive full of hope and leave traumatized or cynical or simply gone. And she wrote it down because someone needed to remember, needed to keep track, needed to maintain evidence that these things were happening even if no one with power cared. In 1902, one of those incidents involved a girl Susie had taken under her wing. Her name was Frances Belmont, not a real name. Most chorus girls use stage names, and she was 17, fresh from Philadelphia, desperate for work. Susie had helped her get a position in the chorus of the Wild Rose, had even let Frances stay in her boarding house room for 2 weeks until the girl could afford her own lodging. They'd become close. Frances trusted her. So when Stanford White's secretary approached Frances backstage with an invitation to visit White's studio to discuss artistic opportunities, Frances asked Susie what she should do. Susie told her the truth, that White was dangerous, that his invitations weren't about art, that girls who went to his apartment often came back different or didn't come back at all. She begged Frances not to go. But Frances was 17 and poor and ambitious. The secretary had mentioned money, the possibility of better roles, connections to important people. She went to the apartment on 24th Street on a Thursday evening in October. She returned to the theater 3 days later, collected her few possessions from her dressing area, and disappeared. Susie never saw her again. Letters to Frances's boarding house went unanswered. Her stage name appeared in no other show rosters. She'd simply vanished into the vast anonymous population of New York City. Susie went to the theater manager, a man named Charles Dillingham who prided himself on running a respectable establishment. She told him what had happened. She showed him her notebook with its documented patterns of Stanford White's behavior. She asked him to ban White from backstage access, to stop allowing his secretary to recruit girls from the chorus, to do something to protect the women who worked in his theater. Dillingham listened politely. Then he explained reality. Stanford White was a major theatrical patron. He attended shows regularly, often bringing important guests. He designed theatrical spaces, had connections to wealthy investors who funded productions. Banning him would be financial suicide for the theater. And besides, what exactly was Susie accusing him of? Taking girls to dinner? Offering them opportunities? If Frances Belmont had chosen to leave the show, that was her decision. Young women came and went from the theater all the time. It didn't mean anything sinister had happened. As for Susie's notebook, Dillingham suggested she destroy it. Keeping such records could be seen as gossip-mongering or even blackmail material. If White or anyone else discovered she was maintaining a list of accusations against prominent men, she could be sued for defamation. She could lose her position. She could find herself unemployable in any theater in the city. He wasn't threatening her, he said. He was protecting her from her own misguided instinct to get involved in matters that weren't her concern. Susie kept the notebook, but she stopped showing it to people. She continued documenting incidents, but she understood now that her records would never be used in any official capacity. They were just her own private attempt to impose order on a chaotic system that protected powerful men and discarded vulnerable women. When the Stanford White murder dominated the newspapers in 1906, Susie recognized the apartment described in the coverage. She recognized the patterns in Evelyn Nesbit's testimony, the champagne, the confusion, the assault disguised as seduction. She'd heard variations of that same story dozens of times from dozens of different girls, and she thought, finally, that her documentation might matter, that someone might want to know about the pattern, the scope, the years of warnings that had been ignored. She wrote to Harry Thaw's defense team. She offered her notebook as evidence. She explained that she could testify about Stanford White's reputation in the theater community, about the warnings that circulated, about the girls who disappeared after visiting his apartment. She received no response. She wrote again. Still nothing. Finally, she went in person to the offices of Thaw's lead attorney, Delphin Delmas, and insisted on speaking to someone. A junior attorney met with her for 20 minutes. He looked through her notebook with barely concealed impatience. Then he explained why her testimony wouldn't be useful. First, none of the names in her book were real names. They were stage names, and tracking down the actual women would be nearly impossible. Second, her documentation was informal and could easily be dismissed as gossip or even fabrication. Third, and most importantly, Susie Johnson was a seamstress with no social standing, no education, and no credibility in a courtroom. Defense attorneys from the prosecution would destroy her on the stand by questioning her motives, her character, and her judgment. What we need, the attorney told her, is respectable testimony from respectable people. You understand, Miss Johnson. The jury needs to believe our witnesses. A woman in your position, working in the theater, keeping suspicious records about prominent men. It wouldn't play well. They'd make you look like a scorned woman or someone with an agenda. Susie asked the obvious question. What if I'm telling the truth? The attorney smiled, not unkindly. In a courtroom, Miss Johnson, truth and believability aren't always the same thing. She was never called to testify. Her notebook, with its years of careful documentation, was never entered into evidence. The patterns she'd identified were never examined by the court. The names of the women who could have corroborated Evelyn Nesbit's story were never investigated. Because Susie Johnson was a seamstress, and seamstresses didn't get to decide what evidence mattered in trials involving millionaires. Years later, in 1928, a young journalist named Helen Bullitt Lowry was researching a retrospective piece on the Stanford White case for the New York World. Through connections in the theater world, she tracked down Susie Johnson, by then 49 years old, and working as a wardrobe supervisor at the Shubert Theater. Susie still had her notebook. She showed it to Lowry, explained the entries, described what she'd witnessed over her years in the theater. Lowry wrote an article titled, "The Women Who Tried to Warn Us About Stanford White." Her editor killed it. Too salacious, he said. Too controversial. Too likely to open the newspaper to lawsuits from White's surviving family members. The piece never ran. Lowry's notes from the interview sat in her personal papers for decades before being donated to a library archive, where they remained largely unexamined until researchers began asking different questions about the case. Susie Johnson's notebook still exists. It's in the Billy Rose Theater Division at the New York Public Library, cataloged as Anonymous Costume Designer's Workbook, circa 1899 to 1906. For years, archivists assumed the marginal notes were just theatrical gossip. It wasn't until 2003 that a researcher named Patricia Sullivan recognized what the notebook actually was. A contemporary record of sexual predation in the Broadway theater district, maintained by a working-class woman who understood that no one would believe her without documentation, and who turned out to be right. The notebook contains 43 separate entries related to Stanford White over a 7-year period. 43 incidents. 43 warnings. 43 young women whose experiences were documented by someone who cared enough to remember, even though she knew no one would listen. Giuseppe Moretti arrived in New York from Naples in 1894, part of the great wave of Italian immigration that transformed the city at the turn of the century. He was 19 years old, spoke almost no English, and carried with him a letter of introduction to a distant cousin who worked in the construction trades. Within 2 years, Giuseppe had found steady work as a plasterer and ornamental sculptor, skills he'd learned from his father back in Italy. His talent with decorative plasterwork eventually brought him to the attention of architectural firms looking for craftsmen who could execute the elaborate Beaux-Arts designs that defined Gilded Age excess. In 1898, Giuseppe was hired as part of a crew working on interior renovations to Stanford White's apartment at 24 West 24th Street. The job lasted 3 months, installing ornamental moldings, repairing ceiling medallions, creating custom plasterwork for the infamous room with the red velvet swing. It was prestigious work for an immigrant laborer, and Giuseppe was grateful for the opportunity. He was 23, ambitious, trying to save enough money to bring his younger brother to America. But Giuseppe saw things during those 3 months that troubled him deeply. The apartment wasn't just a studio or a private retreat. It was clearly designed for specific purposes that had nothing to do with architecture. The swing wasn't decorative, it was functional, suspended from reinforced ceiling beams that Giuseppe himself had helped install. The mirrors weren't randomly placed. They were positioned with geometric precision to reflect specific angles of specific furniture. The separate entrance, the soundproofed walls, the locks on the inside of doors, everything about the space was calculated. And there were the girls. Giuseppe and his crew worked during the day, usually arriving at 8 in the morning and leaving by 5 in the evening. But occasionally they'd arrive to find evidence of recent occupation. Glasses on tables, clothing forgotten in corners, once a woman's shoe under the bed. Several times, Giuseppe encountered young women leaving the building early in the morning, while he and his crew were arriving. These weren't society women. They were young, often appearing disoriented or upset, clearly from working-class backgrounds based on their clothing and demeanor. Giuseppe wasn't naive. He understood that wealthy men had mistresses, that sexual relationships existed outside of marriage. But something about these encounters felt wrong to him. The girls looked too young. They looked confused rather than knowing. And he'd overheard enough conversations between Stanford White and his manservant to understand that the women weren't there by their own initiative. They were being brought there, often under false pretenses. One incident particularly disturbed him. In October 1898, Giuseppe was working alone in the apartment one afternoon, touching up plasterwork in the main room, when he heard sounds from the bedroom, crying, someone saying no repeatedly, then silence. He stood frozen, unsure what to do. This was his employer's private residence. He was an Italian immigrant with limited English and no social standing. What right did he have to interfere in Stanford White's private affairs? He knocked on the bedroom door, called out that he needed to measure something in that room, a transparent excuse. The crying stopped. After several long minutes, Stanford White emerged, adjusting his collar, and told Giuseppe in cold, clear English that the plasterer should focus on his work and not concern himself with matters that didn't involve him. Then White left the apartment entirely. Giuseppe cautiously opened the bedroom door and found a girl. She couldn't have been more than 15, sitting on the bed, her dress torn, mascara running down her face. Giuseppe's English was limited, but he managed to ask if she needed help, if she wanted him to call police. The girl's response was immediate and terrified, no police. She begged him not to tell anyone, not to report what he'd heard. She was afraid, though Giuseppe couldn't tell if she was afraid of White or of the consequences of accusing him. She left quickly, and Giuseppe never saw her again. That evening, Giuseppe discussed the incident with his foreman, an Irish-American named Patrick O'Shea, who'd been in the construction business for 20 years. O'Shea's response was pragmatic and chilling. Keep your mouth shut and do your job. Stanford White is one of the most important architects in New York. We're lucky to get work from him. You make accusations against a man like that, and you'll never work in the city again. Besides, you're Italian. Who's going to believe you over him? The message was clear. Giuseppe finished the job, collected his wages, and tried to forget what he'd witnessed. But he couldn't. The memory haunted him, particularly because he knew that his silence had allowed the pattern to continue. How many other girls had visited that apartment after the one he'd encountered? How many more would there be? In 1903, Giuseppe's conscience finally overwhelmed his self-preservation instinct. He went to the police precinct in his neighborhood, the 14th precinct on West 20th Street. His English had improved over the years, and he was able to communicate clearly enough to describe what he'd witnessed during his work at Stanford White's apartment. He told the desk officer about the crying girl, about the multiple young women he'd seen leaving the building in distressed states, about the deliberately constructed nature of the apartment's design. The officer listened, took no notes, and then explained reality to Giuseppe. First, what he was describing had happened 5 years earlier. Second, he hadn't actually witnessed any crime being committed. Third, he was making serious accusations against one of New York's most prominent citizens based on ambiguous observations. Fourth, and most importantly, Giuseppe was an immigrant. His testimony would carry no weight. If anything, bringing such accusations could make him vulnerable to charges of defamation or making false reports. The officer also pointed out something Giuseppe hadn't fully considered. If Stanford White wanted to retaliate, he could easily do so. White had connections throughout the city's construction industry. One word from him, and Giuseppe would find himself unemployable. His family back in Italy depended on the money he sent home. His brother had finally joined him in New York and was working in the same trades. Was Giuseppe really willing to sacrifice all of that based on something he'd witnessed years earlier? Giuseppe left the precinct understanding that the legal system wasn't designed to protect the powerless or punish the powerful. It was designed to maintain social order, and social order meant not disrupting the lives of important men based on the testimony of Italian immigrants. When the Stanford White murder filled the newspapers in 1906, Giuseppe's first reaction was complicated relief. Someone had stopped White. Someone had held him accountable, even if the method was murder rather than justice. Giuseppe read every article about the case, looking for mention of other victims, other witnesses, other people who tried to warn about White's behavior. He found very little. During the first trial, Giuseppe wrote a letter to the district attorney's office. His English was better by then, though still marked by his accent and imperfect grammar. He described his work in White's apartment 8 years earlier. He described what he'd witnessed and heard. He offered to testify about the apartment's design, about the crying girl, about the pattern he'd observed. He explained that he had no personal connection to any of the parties involved. He simply wanted to tell the truth about what he'd seen. He received no response. He wrote again, this time to Harry Thaw's defense team. Still nothing. Finally, he went in person to the courthouse during the trial, waited for hours, and managed to speak briefly with a clerk who worked for the defense attorneys. The clerk took his name and information, promised someone would follow up. No one ever did. Giuseppe did eventually testify, but not in the dramatic fashion he'd imagined. He was called as a minor witness to confirm basic facts about the apartment's layout and construction. His testimony lasted less than 15 minutes. He was not allowed to describe what he'd witnessed there, as the judge ruled it was hearsay and prejudicial. The defense wanted to establish that the apartment was designed for seduction, and Giuseppe could speak to its construction, but he couldn't speak to what he'd actually seen happen there. During cross-examination, the prosecutor focused almost entirely on Giuseppe's immigrant status. His accent was thick enough that several times he had to repeat himself for the jury's benefit. The prosecutor asked about his education. He'd attended school only until age 12. He asked about Giuseppe's understanding of American social customs, implying that perhaps the Italian immigrant had misinterpreted normal behavior through his foreign lens. He asked whether Giuseppe had ever been in trouble with the law. He hadn't, but the question itself planted suspicion. Most devastatingly, the prosecutor asked why. If Giuseppe had truly witnessed something criminal in 1898, he'd waited 8 years until Stanford White was dead to come forward. The implication was obvious. Giuseppe was an opportunist trying to insert himself into a sensational case, perhaps hoping for payment from the newspapers or reward money from the defense team. Giuseppe tried to explain that he had tried to come forward, that he'd gone to the police in 1903, that no one would listen to him. But he had no documentation of that police visit. No report had been filed. It was his word alone, and an Italian immigrant's word counted for very little in a courtroom filled with wealthy Americans, deciding the fate of other wealthy Americans. The newspapers barely mentioned his testimony. The few accounts that did described him as an Italian workman who claimed to have observed questionable activities, or simply a construction worker. His name was often misspelled, Joseph Moretti or Giuseppe Morello. His testimony was treated as background detail, easily dismissed, certainly not worth the same coverage given to alienists and character witnesses from Stanford White's social circle. After the trial, Giuseppe returned to his life. He continued working as a plasterer and ornamental sculptor. He eventually became a foreman himself, supervising other immigrant craftsmen on construction projects throughout the city. He married, had children, became an American citizen. He lived until 1952, dying at age 76 in a small apartment in Brooklyn, surrounded by grandchildren who knew him as a quiet man who rarely talked about his past. But in 1947, near the end of his life, Giuseppe was interviewed by a graduate student from Columbia University who was researching Italian immigrant experiences in the construction trades. During that interview, Giuseppe mentioned the Stanford White case, not as sensational gossip, but as an example of how immigrant workers were expected to ignore whatever they witnessed in wealthy homes and remain silent about the secret lives of their employers. The graduate student, more interested in labor conditions than old scandals, included only a brief mention of Giuseppe's story in his dissertation. But the full interview transcript survived in the university archives, where it sat for decades, before being rediscovered by researchers examining the social dynamics of the Gilded Age. That transcript reveals something crucial. Giuseppe Moretti understood exactly what was happening in that apartment. He recognized predatory behavior when he saw it. He tried to report it through proper channels. And he was dismissed not because he was lying or mistaken, but because he was Italian, working class, and therefore invisible to a justice system that only recognized certain types of witnesses as credible. He saw everything. He told the truth. And it didn't matter. Her name was Alice Hartley, and she was 11 years old in the summer of 1901 when she saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Alice lived with her family in a modest brownstone apartment on West 23rd Street, just around the corner from Stanford White's private studio. Her father worked as a clerk for an insurance company. Her mother took in sewing to supplement the family income. Alice had 2 younger brothers and an older sister who worked in a department store. They were respectable working poor, not destitute, but perpetually one crisis away from financial disaster. Alice was a bright child, observant and precocious, the kind of girl who noticed things adults thought children wouldn't understand. She'd learned to read at age 4. She kept a diary, though most entries were the mundane observations of childhood, what she had for dinner, arguments with her brothers, books she'd read. But in August 1901, her diary entries took a darker turn. The Hartley family's apartment building had a shared backyard that connected to the alley behind Stanford White's building on 24th Street. It wasn't a particularly nice space, mostly dirt and weeds, with a few struggling plants that the tenants tried to maintain. But it was where the children played, where laundry was hung to dry, where residents escaped the stifling heat of their apartments during New York's brutal summers. Alice spent a lot of time in that yard, often reading under the single tree that provided shade. From that vantage point, she had a clear view of the rear entrance to White's building. She noticed patterns. A particular carriage would arrive, always in the evening, usually around 8 o'clock. Young women would exit the carriage and enter through the back door. Alice noticed that they often looked nervous, that they were always alone, that they were always very young, not much older than her sister who was 17. Sometimes the women would leave within an hour or two, walking quickly, heads down. Sometimes they wouldn't emerge until the next morning. Alice noticed the difference in their demeanor when they left. The ones who departed quickly often looked upset or frightened. The ones who left in the morning sometimes looked dazed, moving slowly, as if they weren't entirely certain where they were. Children have an instinct for wrongness. Alice didn't understand the specific nature of what she was witnessing, but she understood that something bad was happening in that building. She mentioned it to her mother once, describing the carriage and the girls. Her mother told her sharply not to stare at other people's business, not to gossip, and not to ask questions about matters that didn't concern her. The building belonged to a very important man, her mother said, and it was rude to spy on important people. But Alice couldn't stop noticing. And then, on August 15, 1901, she witnessed something she couldn't ignore or rationalize away. It was late evening, around 9 o'clock, but still light enough to see clearly. Alice was in the yard, supposedly retrieving laundry her mother had forgotten to bring in earlier. In reality, she'd been reading, losing track of time the way children do with books. She heard a sound from the alley, a door opening. Then she saw a girl emerge from the back entrance of White's building. The girl was young, perhaps 16 or 17. She wasn't wearing shoes. She was holding them in one hand, along with her stockings. Her dress was buttoned incorrectly. Her hair, which had clearly been styled earlier, was now disheveled. And she was crying, not sobbing, but silent tears that reflected the gaslight from the alley. She stood outside the door for several minutes, as if trying to compose herself, then started walking unsteadily toward the street. Alice did something she'd been taught never to do. She spoke to a stranger. She called out, asked if the girl needed help. The girl startled, noticing Alice for the first time. For a moment, they just looked at each other, an 11-year-old child and a traumatized teenager, separated by a fence but connected by a moment of recognition. The girl shook her head, put a finger to her lips in a shushing gesture, and hurried away. Alice wrote about the encounter in her diary that night. The entry is remarkably detailed for a child. She described the girl's appearance, her emotional state, the way she'd emerged from the building looking like she'd been hurt, but was trying to hide it. Alice wrote that she wished she could have helped, that she felt guilty for just watching, that she didn't understand what was happening but knew it was wrong. She told her older sister what she'd seen. Her sister, 17 and worldlier than Alice, understood more than their mother had. She explained, in careful terms, that sometimes wealthy men did bad things to poor girls, and that it wasn't something people talked about openly. She told Alice to stop watching the building, to stop thinking about it, and absolutely never to mention it to anyone outside the family. Nothing good comes from knowing too much about what important men do, her sister said. But Alice didn't stop watching. Over the next several months, she documented patterns in her diary. She estimated that young women entered that building 2 or 3 times a week. She noted that they always came in the evening, always through the back entrance, always alone. She described their appearances, their ages, their emotional states when they left. She was creating, without fully understanding it, a documentary record of Stanford White's predation as witnessed by a child who had no framework for understanding what she was seeing but enough intelligence to know it mattered. In March 1902, Alice's sister got engaged to a young man who worked as a clerk in the same insurance office as their father. The wedding was planned for June. The family was happy, focused on preparations and expenses, and Alice's sister, in the confidence of impending marriage, told her fiancé about what Alice had been observing. She meant it as a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers that existed for young women in the city. The fiancé, whose name was Thomas Brennan, reacted differently than expected. He was outraged, not at Stanford White, but at the idea that a child was being exposed to knowledge of such sordid matters. He insisted that the family do something to protect Alice's innocence. He suggested they speak to the landlord about screening the view to the alley, or move to a different apartment entirely. Failing that, perhaps they should report what Alice had witnessed to the authorities. Alice's father, practical and risk-averse, explained why reporting was impossible. Stanford White was one of the most powerful men in New York. Making accusations against him based on a child's observations would accomplish nothing except bringing unwanted attention to their family. Who would believe an 11-year-old girl? And even if they did believe her, what exactly had she witnessed? Women entering and leaving a building? That wasn't evidence of a crime. That was just speculation and gossip. Thomas wasn't satisfied, but he deferred to his future father-in-law's judgment. The matter was dropped. Alice was forbidden from playing in the yard unsupervised. The diary entries about Stanford White's building stopped, and the family moved on, focused on the wedding and their own survival in an expensive city. When Stanford White was shot in 1906, Alice was 16 years old. She read the newspaper coverage with a mixture of vindication and horror. Everything she'd intuited as a child was being confirmed in print. The apartment, the young women, the pattern of predation. It had all been real. She'd witnessed evidence of it for months, and no one had listened because she was a child. During the first trial, Alice considered coming forward. She was older now, more articulate, capable of describing what she'd seen. But her family was united in opposition. Her father pointed out that she'd been 11 at the time, that her testimony would be dismissed as the confused memories of a child, that even bringing it up would expose their family to unwanted scrutiny and possible retaliation. Her sister, now married and pregnant, begged her not to get involved. Her mother simply forbade it. Alice wrote a letter anyway. She addressed it directly to the judge overseeing the case, Judge James Fitzgerald. In careful, precise handwriting, she described what she'd witnessed in 1901 and 1902. She acknowledged that she'd been a child, but insisted that her observations had been accurate. She offered her diary as evidence, 5 years of entries that documented patterns and incidents. She wanted, she wrote, for the court to understand that Stanford White's behavior hadn't been a secret, that people had known, even children had known, and that the real scandal wasn't the murder on the rooftop, but the years of predation that had been allowed to continue. The letter was never entered into evidence. A clerk in the judge's chambers, following standard protocol for unsolicited correspondence, filed it away without the judge ever seeing it. It remained in the case files, unexamined, for over a century. When historians finally discovered it in 2008, buried in boxes of trial documents at the New York County Courthouse, they found a teenage girl's detailed account of witnessing sexual predation, written with careful precision and obvious sincerity, completely ignored by the justice system. Alice's diary still exists. Her descendants donated it to the New York Historical Society in 1995, after her death at age 93. For years, it was cataloged simply as Teenage Girl's Diary, early 1900s, and stored with dozens of similar documents. Researchers interested in daily life, fashion, education, or family dynamics would occasionally pull it for reference. But no one connected Alice Hartley's childhood observations to the Stanford White case until a doctoral student, researching children's perspectives on Gilded Age urban life, recognized the address mentioned in the diary entries and realized what she was reading. The diary entries are remarkably precise. Alice documented approximately 70 separate instances of young women entering Stanford White's building between August 1901 and March 1902. She described their approximate ages, their clothing, their emotional states. She noted which ones left quickly and which ones stayed overnight. She recorded the dates and times with the meticulousness of a child who understood she was witnessing something important, even if she couldn't fully articulate what it was. Legal scholars who've examined Alice's diary now recognize it as potentially the most detailed contemporary documentation of Stanford White's pattern of behavior. It corroborates Evelyn Nesbit's timeline. It confirms Margaret O'Brien's observations. It establishes that White's predation wasn't occasional but systematic, multiple young women per week, over extended periods, following consistent patterns. But in 1907, when the trial was underway, Alice Hartley was 16 years old and female and working class, describing events she'd witnessed as an 11-year-old child. Her testimony would have been dismissed automatically. Children weren't considered reliable witnesses. Their perceptions were assumed to be confused, their memories unreliable, their understanding incomplete. The legal system had no mechanism for incorporating a child's observations into a case involving powerful adults, especially when that child was describing events she'd witnessed, but not fully understood at the time. Alice never testified. Her diary was never examined. Her letter to the judge was never read. She lived a long life, married, had children, worked as a teacher, died in 1981, surrounded by grandchildren who knew her as a kind, observant woman who'd lived through fascinating times. She rarely talked about the Stanford White case, even after her diary was donated to the Historical Society. When asked about it in a 1976 oral history interview, she simply said, "I saw what I saw. I wrote it down. No one wanted to know. That's how things worked back then. That's how things worked. Children saw. Children knew. Children documented. And children were systematically excluded from any conversation about justice, their observations dismissed as irrelevant, their voices silenced by assumptions about age and credibility and appropriate knowledge." Alice Hartley saw everything a child could see from a backyard in 1901. She understood enough to know it was wrong. She had the courage to write it down and try to tell someone. And it didn't matter, because the justice system wasn't designed to hear from children, especially children who'd witnessed the crimes of powerful men. The official trial transcripts of People versus Harry K. Thaw run to over 3,000 pages across 2 trials. They're preserved in the New York County Courthouse archives, bound in leather volumes that smell of decay and time. For decades, historians and true crime enthusiasts focused on the sensational testimony, Evelyn Nesbit's 3 days on the stand, the alienists debating Harry Thaw's sanity, the dramatic confrontations between defense and prosecution. But buried in those thousands of pages are testimonies from witnesses whose words were documented, transcribed, and then effectively erased from the historical narrative. What's remarkable isn't just that these witnesses testified. It's how their testimonies were edited, reframed, and dismissed in real time through cross-examination, judicial rulings, and newspaper coverage. We can trace, line by line, how truth was transformed into something inadmissible, how credible observations were recast as unreliable speculation, how a justice system ostensibly seeking truth worked systematically to exclude inconvenient voices. Margaret O'Brien, the Irish housekeeper, testified on February 11, 1907, during the first trial. Her examination by Harry Thaw's defense attorney, Delphin Delmas, lasted 43 minutes. She described her work cleaning Stanford White's apartment, the young women she'd encountered, the evidence of activity she'd found. She was precise, detailed, and unflinching. She described finding torn clothing, bloodstained linens, champagne bottles, and photographs. Explicit photographs that White apparently kept as trophies. Then came cross-examination by District Attorney William Travers Jerome. Jerome didn't challenge O'Brien's factual observations. Instead, he dismantled her credibility through a series of questions designed to highlight her class position and potential bias. The key exchange appears on page 1847 of the trial transcript. Jerome asked, "Mrs. O'Brien, you continued working for Mr. White for 8 years, correct?" O'Brien, "Yes, sir." Jerome, "And during those 8 years, he paid you regularly?" O'Brien, "Yes, sir." Jerome, "He treated you with respect?" O'Brien, "He was polite, yes." Jerome, "He gave you Christmas bonuses?" O'Brien, "Sometimes, yes." Jerome, "And yet you now come before this court, after his death, and accuse him of terrible crimes. Crimes you allegedly witnessed, but never reported to any authority while he was alive to defend himself. Is that correct?" The question was designed to be unanswerable. If O'Brien said yes, she appeared opportunistic. If she tried to explain why she hadn't reported, that she had tried, that no one would listen, she sounded defensive. The transcript shows she attempted to explain, but Judge Fitzgerald cut her off, ruling that her previous attempts to report were hearsay and inadmissible. The newspapers the next day described O'Brien's testimony as confused and questionable. The New York Times wrote, "An Irish domestic, whose testimony was marked by evident class resentment, claimed to have witnessed irregular activities in the deceased's apartment, though she offered no explanation for her failure to report such activities at the time." The Evening World was more direct. Cleaning woman's testimony dismissed as unreliable. What the newspapers didn't report was what happened after Jerome's cross-examination. The transcript shows that Judge Fitzgerald called both attorneys to the bench for a sidebar discussion. The judge's concern, stated explicitly, was that allowing too much testimony about Stanford White's behavior with women would inflame the jury against the victim and create sympathy for the defendant. He instructed the prosecution to vigorously challenge any witness who attempted to corroborate Evelyn Nesbit's claims about White's character. In other words, the judge, the person ostensibly ensuring a fair trial, was actively instructing prosecutors to undermine witnesses whose testimony might support the defense's narrative. This wasn't about finding truth. This was about protecting Stanford White's reputation and ensuring that Harry Thaw was convicted of murder regardless of context or motive. Susie Johnson, the seamstress with her documentary notebook, faced similar treatment. She testified on February 19, 1907. The defense had convinced the judge to allow limited testimony about Stanford White's reputation in the theatrical community. Susie brought her notebook, which defense attorneys hoped to enter as evidence of White's pattern of behavior. During direct examination, Susie read from her entries. She described warnings that circulated among theater workers, specific incidents involving named chorus girls, and the general atmosphere of fear surrounding White's backstage presence. She was articulate and specific. The transcript shows the courtroom was silent during her testimony, until the prosecution objected and Judge Fitzgerald called another sidebar. The objection was technical but devastating. Susie's notebook entries were hearsay. She was documenting what other people had told her, not what she'd personally witnessed. The judge ruled that she could testify only about her own direct observations, not about warnings or reports from other women. This ruling effectively gutted her testimony. Susie had seen Stanford White backstage, had watched him select young women, but she hadn't personally witnessed any assault. Her value as a witness was her documentation of patterns, and the court ruled that patterns were inadmissible. During cross-examination, the prosecution focused on Susie's notebook itself. Jerome asked why she'd kept such detailed records. Was she planning to blackmail someone? Was she hoping to sell information to newspapers? Did she have a personal grudge against Stanford White? Had she ever been rebuffed by him or passed over for some opportunity? The questions were designed to imply that Susie's documentation was motivated by spite or greed, rather than genuine concern. The transcript shows Susie's frustration breaking through her composed demeanor. On page 2154, she responded to one of Jerome's insinuations. I kept records because someone needed to remember. Because these girls mattered, even if no one else thought so. Because I knew that someday, someone would want to know the truth. Jerome's reply, or because you thought someday those records might be valuable to you financially? Judge Fitzgerald sustained the prosecution's characterization. Susie's notebook was never entered into evidence. Her testimony was limited to a few minutes of general observations about theatrical culture. The newspapers described her as a seamstress who kept suspicious records, and a woman whose motivations for maintaining detailed accusations against prominent men remain unclear. Giuseppe Moretti, the Italian plasterer, faced the most overtly xenophobic treatment. His testimony on March 2, 1907, was repeatedly interrupted by objections about translation and clarity. Moretti's English was heavily accented but comprehensible. Yet the prosecution repeatedly claimed they couldn't understand him, forcing him to repeat answers, undermining his credibility through theatrical confusion. The transcript shows District Attorney Jerome asking Moretti to spell his name multiple times, deliberately mispronouncing it, and at one point asking if Moretti was familiar with American standards of privacy and appropriate behavior between men and women. The implication was clear. As an Italian immigrant, Moretti might be misinterpreting normal American social interactions through his foreign cultural lens. When Moretti described hearing a girl crying in Stanford White's bedroom, Jerome interrupted. Mr. Moretti, in Italy, do women not sometimes cry for dramatic effect? Is that not part of your cultural temperament, to be emotional and expressive? The question was outrageous, based on ethnic stereotypes rather than facts. But it worked. The jury, composed entirely of white American-born men, visibly dismissed Moretti after that exchange. His testimony lasted less than 15 minutes. The newspapers barely mentioned it, and when they did, they described him as an Italian workman whose broken English and confused testimony added little to the proceedings. Alice Hartley never testified, but her letter to Judge Fitzgerald provides insight into how the court handled testimonies from young witnesses. The few teenagers who did testify, chorus girls who'd known Evelyn Nesbit, young women who'd encountered Stanford White, were subjected to brutal cross-examinations about their sexual histories, their moral character, and their potential motivations for lying. One 16-year-old witness, identified in transcripts only as Miss D, testified about seeing Stanford White with very young girls backstage at the Casino Theater. During cross-examination, Jerome asked about her own romantic history, whether she'd ever been alone with men, whether she drank alcohol, and whether she understood the difference between consensual relationships and assault. The clear message: young women, especially those who worked in theater, couldn't be trusted to accurately report their own experiences, let alone serve as reliable witnesses about someone else's victimization. What's striking about reading these transcripts in full is recognizing how consistent the dismissal tactics were. Every marginalized witness faced similar treatment. Questions about their finances, their motivations, their character, their reliability. Every attempt to establish a pattern of behavior was ruled hearsay or speculation. Every piece of documentary evidence, O'Brien's observations, Johnson's notebook, Moretti's timeline, was excluded as prejudicial or unreliable. Meanwhile, testimony from Stanford White's social peers was treated as unimpeachable fact. Architects who'd known White for years testified about his good character. Club members described him as generous and kind. Business associates praised his professional integrity. None of these witnesses were asked about their potential bias, their financial connections to White's legacy, or their motivations for defending a dead man. Their words were simply accepted as truth. The contrast reveals the trial's actual purpose. This wasn't an investigation into what happened in Stanford White's apartment or why Harry Thaw shot him. This was a class-based sorting of whose testimony mattered, whose experiences counted, and whose truth was worth believing. The marginalized witnesses told consistent, detailed, corroborated stories about predatory patterns. The wealthy witnesses told vague, general stories about White's character. The court believed the latter and dismissed the former. If cases like this fascinate you, where the truth lives in the margins of official records, where justice depends on who's telling the story, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Because sometimes the most damning evidence isn't what made it into the verdict. It's what was deliberately excluded from consideration. The trial transcripts still exist, preserved in climate-controlled archives. For over a century, they were read primarily for their sensational content. Evelyn Nesbit's beauty, Harry Thaw's madness, Stanford White's fall from grace. But when you read them looking for different voices, searching for the testimonies that were buried, you find something more disturbing. A justice system that functioned exactly as designed, protecting power by ensuring that challenges to power remained unheard. Margaret O'Brien said she saw bloodstained sheets. Susie Johnson documented 70 incidents. Giuseppe Moretti heard a girl crying. Alice Hartley watched young women emerge from that building in distress for months. They told the truth. They provided evidence. They corroborated each other's observations without coordination or conspiracy. And it didn't matter, because the truth, in 1907, wasn't determined by evidence or consistency or documentation. It was determined by who was speaking, who was listening, and who had the power to decide what counted as credible testimony. The marginalized witnesses were right. History has proven them right. But they weren't believed, and that distinction is everything. In 1907, the verdict came down. Harry Kendall Thaw was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He'd killed Stanford White in front of hundreds of witnesses, but the jury determined he'd been temporarily insane when he did it, driven mad by learning the full extent of what White had done to his wife. Thaw was committed to the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane, from which he would later escape, fight for his release through legal channels, and eventually walk free. He died in 1947, having lived another 40 years after shooting a man on a rooftop. The verdict was celebrated by some as justice for Evelyn Nesbit and punishment for Stanford White's predatory behavior. Others saw it as a miscarriage of justice, a rich man literally getting away with murder because he could afford the best lawyers and the most sympathetic narrative. But almost no one questioned whether the trial had actually uncovered the truth about what happened in that apartment on 24th Street, or whether the right people had been held accountable. The official narrative settled into place quickly. Stanford White, brilliant architect, tragic victim of his own appetites, a man whose genius was tainted by moral weakness. Evelyn Nesbit, the beautiful victim, forever young and tragic in public memory, her testimony cementing her place in American mythology. Harry Thaw, the mad avenger, righteous or delusional depending on who was telling the story. These were the three figures who mattered, the three whose names would be remembered. Everyone else, the housekeepers, seamstresses, plasterers, chorus girls, servants, and children who'd witnessed the patterns and tried to sound warnings, disappeared from the narrative. Their testimonies were footnotes in the trial transcripts, if they appeared at all. Their names were misspelled or omitted in newspaper accounts. Their stories were dismissed as tangential to the real drama of the love triangle and the murder. But what if we reconsider the case by centering those forgotten voices instead of sidelining them? What if we treat Margaret O'Brien, Susie Johnson, Giuseppe Moretti, and Alice Hartley not as minor witnesses, but as the people who actually understood what was happening? What emerges is a fundamentally different story, not about three people caught in a tragic love triangle, but about a systemic pattern of predation enabled by wealth, protected by social hierarchies, and stopped only through violence, because every other avenue for justice had been deliberately closed. Start with the timeline. Stanford White's predatory behavior didn't begin with Evelyn Nesbit in 1901. Margaret O'Brien started cleaning his apartment in 1898, and she described evidence suggesting the pattern was already well established by then. Alice Hartley's observations began in 1901 and documented systematic activity, multiple young women per week visiting that apartment. Susie Johnson's notebook entries spanned 1899 to 1906 and reference 43 separate incidents, specifically involving Stanford White, plus dozens more involving other predatory men in the theatrical world. This wasn't occasional bad behavior. This was industrial-scale exploitation, sustained over at least 8 years, possibly longer. Conservative estimates based on the documented testimonies suggest Stanford White may have assaulted or coerced dozens of young women, possibly more than 100. Yet the trial treated Evelyn Nesbit's experience as an isolated incident rather than one example of a systematic pattern. Now consider the warnings that were ignored. Giuseppe Moretti tried to report what he'd witnessed in 1903, 3 years before the murder. Margaret O'Brien spoke to her priest in 1903 and attempted to file a police report in 1905. Susie Johnson approached theater management in 1902. Alice Hartley's sister told her fiancé about the pattern in 1902. These weren't retrospective accusations made after White's death. These were contemporary attempts to intervene, to warn, to stop what was happening. Every single attempt was shut down, not because the accusations weren't credible, but because the accusers weren't credible, according to a social system that defined credibility by class, ethnicity, gender, and proximity to power. The priest told Margaret to be grateful for her job. The police told Giuseppe that important men deserved privacy. The theater manager told Susie that banning White would be financial suicide. The family told Alice's sister that children shouldn't know about such things. Each individual dismissal seemed reasonable within its context. Of course a priest wouldn't want to make serious accusations without proof. Of course police needed more than an immigrant workman's observations. Of course theater managers had to consider business implications. Of course families wanted to protect children's innocence. But the cumulative effect of all these reasonable individual decisions was a system that made it impossible to hold powerful men accountable, no matter how much evidence accumulated against them. This is where the marginalized testimonies become crucial. They establish that Stanford White's predation wasn't a secret. It was common knowledge among certain populations, theater workers, servants, immigrants who worked in the homes and buildings of the wealthy. These communities had their own information networks, their own warning systems, their own attempts at protection. But those networks existed in parallel to the official institutions of justice and power, with no bridge between them. Susie Johnson's notebook is particularly revealing. She documented not just incidents involving Stanford White, but patterns across the entire theatrical district. Her entries reference at least a dozen other wealthy men who preyed on chorus girls, using similar methods: gifts, promises of advancement, private dinners that turned into assaults. The notebook reveals an entire ecosystem of predation, with Stanford White as perhaps the most prolific, but far from the only practitioner. This broader context reframes the murder. Harry Thaw didn't shoot Stanford White because White had seduced his wife. Thaw shot White because White represented a system of predation that wealthy men participated in and protected. Thaw himself was hardly a hero. His own treatment of Evelyn after their marriage included physical abuse and controlling behavior. But his act of violence, however wrongly motivated, did what the justice system had refused to do. It held Stanford White accountable and exposed the pattern publicly. The trial became a referendum not just on White's behavior, but on whether powerful men could be held responsible for exploiting the powerless. And the verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity, was perfectly calibrated to avoid that larger question. Thaw wasn't acquitted because his actions were justified. He was declared insane, which meant the murder wasn't rational, which meant it couldn't be understood as legitimate accountability. The system maintained its position. Violence wasn't the answer, but neither was listening to working-class witnesses who tried to warn everyone for years. Modern analysis of the case has been hampered by the fact that historians traditionally focused on the three main figures and treated everyone else as background. But recent scholarship has begun re-examining the marginalized testimonies and recognizing their significance. Forensic psychologists looking at the documented patterns now classify Stanford White's behavior as serial predation with clear grooming and coercion tactics. Legal scholars examining the trial transcripts recognize the systematic exclusion of pattern evidence as a failure of justice. Social historians see the case as exemplifying how Gilded Age hierarchies functioned to protect wealthy predators. One particularly illuminating analysis came in 2015 from Dr. Patricia Sullivan, a historian at NYU, who spent 5 years tracking down descendants of trial witnesses and examining their family archives. Sullivan discovered letters, diaries, and private documents that the witnesses themselves never made public. Margaret O'Brien kept a separate record of her cleaning work, with dates and observations she never shared with the court. Giuseppe Moretti wrote letters to his family in Italy describing his moral struggle over what he'd witnessed. Alice Hartley's diary continued for decades, with occasional references back to what she'd seen as a child and her frustration that no one had listened. Sullivan's research revealed something striking. The marginalized witnesses knew each other, or at least knew of each other. Susie Johnson's notebook includes an entry from 1903 that references the Irish woman who cleans W's apartment. She knows what I know. Margaret O'Brien told her priest about the Italian workman who tried to go to police. Giuseppe Moretti mentioned in a letter that the women who work in theater all whisper warnings. They weren't coordinating their testimonies or conspiring together. They were simply existing in overlapping communities where information about dangerous men circulated among the people most vulnerable to those men. This informal network tried to accomplish what the formal justice system wouldn't, protecting potential victims by sharing information about predators. It worked imperfectly. Many young women still ended up in Stanford White's apartment, still suffered assaults, still had their lives damaged or destroyed. But it worked better than the official institutions, which did nothing at all. The real tragedy of a Stanford White case isn't just that he assaulted dozens of young women. It's that the assaults could have been stopped, or at least documented and prosecuted, if the justice system had been willing to listen to witnesses from marginalized communities. Every person who tried to warn authorities was dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with the accuracy of their observations and everything to do with their social standing. Margaret O'Brien was telling the truth. Susie Johnson's documentation was accurate. Giuseppe Moretti correctly identified predatory behavior. Alice Hartley's childhood observations were reliable. They were all right. They all tried to help. They were all ignored. And that's the case reconsidered. Not a simple story of 3 people and 1 murder, but a complex narrative about systematic predation, ignored warnings, and a justice system designed to protect the powerful by ensuring the powerless remain unheard. The marginalized witnesses don't change what happened on that rooftop in 1906, but they change what the murder meant. It wasn't a tragic end to a love triangle. It was the violent culmination of years of unpunished crimes, the inevitable result of a system that refused to acknowledge those crimes until they exploded into public view. The trial answered the narrow question: did Harry Thaw murder Stanford White? Yes, but he was insane, so not legally responsible. But it never addressed the larger question the marginalized witnesses tried to force into the open. How many young women did Stanford White assault? How many people knew? How many tried to stop it? And why did the system fail so completely to protect the vulnerable from the powerful? Those questions remain unanswered by the verdict, but they're answered by the testimonies that were dismissed, the evidence that was excluded, the voices that were silenced. The case reconsidered becomes not a mystery about who or why, but a documentation of how power operates to protect itself, and what happens to truth when it's spoken by people society has decided don't matter. The Stanford White murder trial ended in 1908, but its echoes continued for decades. Harry Thaw served 7 years in the asylum before escaping in 1913, fleeing to Canada, and fighting extradition. He was eventually returned, committed again, and finally released in 1915 after his wealthy family's lawyers successfully argued he was no longer insane. He lived comfortably on his inheritance until his death in 1947, occasionally making headlines for erratic behavior, but never facing consequences for the murder everyone knew he'd committed. Evelyn Nesbit spent the rest of her life trading on her notoriety. She performed in vaudeville, appeared in early films, wrote memoirs, gave interviews. She married twice more, struggled with addiction, faced poverty despite her fame. In 1955, a film called The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing dramatized her story, with Joan Collins playing Evelyn. She died in 1967 at age 82 in a nursing home in California. Still beautiful, still talking about that night on the rooftop 61 years earlier. Stanford White's architectural legacy was systematically dismantled. The original Madison Square Garden, his masterpiece, was demolished in 1925 despite protests from preservationists. His name was removed from buildings he designed. Architectural histories mentioned him briefly, if at all, focusing instead on his partners in the firm of Mead White. For decades, he was known primarily as the architect who was murdered, rather than for his contributions to American architecture. And the witnesses, the ones who tried to warn everyone, who documented the truth, who testified and been dismissed, they vanished completely from the historical narrative. For nearly a century, the Stanford White case was told as a simple story, a love triangle, a murder, a sensational trial. The marginalized voices that tried to complicate that narrative were forgotten, their testimonies gathering dust in archive boxes that no one bothered to examine. But here's what modern forensic analysis reveals. Those forgotten witnesses were describing classic patterns of serial predation. The grooming behaviors, gifts, promises, isolation. The victim selection, young, poor, desperate women with no social support. The methodical approach, a private space designed specifically for assault. A network of enablers who procured victims, systems in place to ensure silence afterward. Stanford White's pattern of behavior matches profiles that forensic psychologists now recognize as characteristic of serial predators who use wealth and power rather than physical force to access victims. The evidence was there all along. Margaret O'Brien described physical evidence of assault, bloodstained linens, torn clothing, signs of violence. Giuseppe Moretti heard verbal evidence, crying, protests, clear lack of consent. Susie Johnson documented temporal patterns, multiple victims per week over years, suggesting compulsive behavior. Alice Hartley observed behavioral patterns, victims entering voluntarily, but leaving traumatized, classic signs of coerced encounters disguised as consensual. Modern investigators examining cold cases would recognize these testimonies as credible and significant. The consistency across multiple witnesses, the specific details, the lack of coordination, suggesting independent observation. All of these are markers of reliable testimony. But in 1907, none of that mattered because the witnesses lacked social credibility. Legal scholars now study the Thaw trials as examples of how the justice system can fail when credibility is determined by social hierarchy rather than evidence. Professor Ellen Hartwell at Columbia Law School has written extensively about how the exclusion of pattern evidence in the Thaw case set precedents that continued to protect predators for decades. The ruling that each assault had to be proved independently, without reference to other incidents, made it nearly impossible to prosecute powerful men whose predation was systematic rather than isolated. The concept of prior bad acts being inadmissible, which the judge used to exclude most of the marginalized testimonies, wasn't designed to protect the innocent. It was designed to protect repeat offenders by ensuring their patterns couldn't be revealed in court. This legal structure remained in place until the late 20th century, when reforms finally allowed pattern evidence in certain cases. But for most of the 1900s, the Thaw trial's precedents helped shield powerful predators by ensuring victims remained isolated and patterns remained invisible. There's another form of injustice worth examining: how history was rewritten to serve particular narratives. In the decades after the trial, the case was romanticized and simplified. Stanford White became the tragic artist, destroyed by scandal. Evelyn Nesbit became the eternal Gibson girl, frozen in time as the beautiful innocent. Harry Thaw became the madman, his violence excused by insanity. This romantic rewriting served multiple purposes. It allowed society to treat the case as an aberration rather than as evidence of systematic problems. It transformed structural predation into individual tragedy. It suggested that justice had been served, the predator was dead, the avenger was punished, the victim survived. The case could be closed, lessons learned, time to move on. But the marginalized witnesses tell a different story. They reveal that the case wasn't closed at all. Stanford White was one predator in an entire system of predation. His death didn't end the pattern. It just removed one practitioner. The theatrical district continued to be a hunting ground for wealthy men. The private apartments continued to serve their purposes. The warnings continued to circulate among chorus girls and seamstresses and servants, still unheard by anyone with power to intervene. Susie Johnson continued working in theater until 1923. Her notebook gained new entries after Stanford White's death, different names, same patterns. In the 1920s, she tried to interest journalists in stories about predation in the theater world, hoping that changing social attitudes might make people more receptive. She found no takers. Editors told her the stories were too salacious, too risky legally. too likely to offend powerful advertisers. Her documentation of decades of systematic abuse died with her in 1934, its significance unrecognized, until researchers rediscovered it 70 years later. Margaret O'Brien continued cleaning homes for wealthy families until arthritis forced her retirement in 1919. She never spoke publicly about the Stanford White case again, but her daughter, interviewed in 1983, remembered her mother's bitterness about the trial. She tried to tell them, the daughter said. She tried to help those girls, and they treated her like she was the problem, not the man who hurt them. It broke something in her, knowing that truth didn't matter if you were poor and Irish. Giuseppe Moretti became a successful foreman, eventually running his own plastering company. He hired other Italian immigrants, taught them the trade, helped them navigate a system that treated them as perpetually foreign. In his later years, according to the Columbia University interview, he told younger workers about the Stanford White case, not as gossip, but as a lesson about power. I saw crimes, he said. I reported crimes. And I learned that justice isn't about what's true. It's about who has power to make their truth matter. Alice Hartley became a teacher, working in public schools in the Bronx for 40 years. She taught girls, mostly, and she made sure they understood things her own mother had tried to keep from her. She taught them that their observations mattered, that their words had value, that they should document what they saw and trust their own judgment even when authorities dismissed them. Former students, contacted by researchers after her death, remembered Miss Hartley as someone who took girls' concerns seriously, who believed them when they reported inappropriate behavior by men, who taught them that they deserved to be heard. These 4 witnesses, along with dozens of others whose testimonies were similarly dismissed, spent the rest of their lives living with the knowledge that they'd seen truth and been told it didn't matter, that they'd tried to prevent harm and been silenced, that they'd offered evidence and been dismissed as unreliable. That's its own form of injustice, separate from but related to the original crimes. It's the injustice of being right and being ignored, of understanding reality and being told you're mistaken, of having evidence and being told it's worthless because of who you are. The Stanford White case didn't just fail the women he assaulted. It failed everyone who tried to stop him, everyone who saw the pattern and sounded warnings, everyone who believed that truth and evidence should matter more than social standing. The justice system didn't fail accidentally. It functioned exactly as designed, protecting power, silencing dissent, ensuring that challenges from below could be safely dismissed. What's your take on this case? Not the simple version about the love triangle and the murder, but the complex reality about systematic predation and ignored warnings. Share your thoughts below, and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking, and sometimes the most important questions aren't about who committed the crime, but about why no one stopped it when they had the chance. In 2019, researchers at the New York Historical Society created a digital archive project called Unheard Witnesses, Marginalized Testimonies in Historic Trials. The Stanford White case was their first focus. They tracked down descendants of witnesses, digitized trial transcripts, examined contemporary newspaper accounts from working-class and immigrant publications that mainstream historians had ignored. They found Alice Hartley's diary, Susie Johnson's notebook, Margaret O'Brien's private records, Giuseppe Moretti's letters. The archive went live in 2021, making these documents publicly accessible for the first time. Researchers, students, and true crime enthusiasts could finally read the full testimonies that had been dismissed or excluded. They could see the patterns the marginalized witnesses had documented. They could understand what really happened in that apartment, not through salacious newspaper accounts or romanticized retellings, but through the words of people who'd actually witnessed the evidence. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Historians revised their accounts of the case. Legal scholars wrote articles about the systemic exclusion of credible testimony. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to the forgotten witnesses. Students wrote dissertations examining how class and ethnicity shaped judicial outcomes. The case was being reconsidered, a century later, through the voices that should have been heard from the beginning. But that reconsideration can't undo the original injustice. It can't restore credibility to witnesses who spent their lives being told they didn't matter. It can't protect the victims, who could have been saved if authorities had listened to early warnings. It can't prevent the decades of similar cases, where marginalized witnesses were similarly dismissed, where patterns went undocumented, where predators continued operating because the people who tried to stop them lacked social power. What it can do is force us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many contemporary cases involve witnesses being dismissed because of their class, race, gender, or immigration status? How many patterns go unrecognized because the people who see them aren't considered credible? How many warnings are ignored because they come from populations that society has decided don't merit belief? How many systems of predation continue operating because challenging them would require listening to voices that power structures are designed to exclude? The Stanford White case is history, but the dynamics it reveals aren't historical. They're ongoing. Every time a working-class witness is treated as less credible than a wealthy one, every time an immigrant's testimony is dismissed because of accent or status, every time a woman's account of assault is questioned based on her profession or behavior, the same systems that failed in 1907 are failing again. Justice was denied in the Stanford White case, not just to Evelyn Nesbit, though she deserved better, not just to the dozens of other victims, though they certainly deserved justice, but to every person who tried to sound warnings and was silenced. To Margaret, Susie, Giuseppe, Alice, and all the others whose testimonies were documented, transcribed, and then dismissed as irrelevant because they came from the wrong people. History has been rewritten slowly, as researchers uncover the voices that were buried. The narrative is changing from a simple story about three people to a complex account of systematic predation and systemic failure. But rewriting history can't undo the past. It can only help us recognize the patterns, understand the mechanisms, and hopefully, though not certainly, avoid repeating the same failures. The marginalized witnesses were right. They saw clearly, documented carefully, and spoke truthfully. They deserved to be heard. And the fact that they weren't, the fact that credibility was determined by social standing rather than evidence, remains one of the case's most damning revelations. Not just about Stanford White's crimes, but about the justice system that protected him by silencing everyone who tried to hold him accountable. That silence has finally been broken. More than a century later, the voices are being heard. The testimonies are being examined. The truth they tried to tell is finally being acknowledged. But it's worth remembering. They tried to tell us all along. We just weren't listening.